So this is a Whiskey 101. It is right back to the bare bones, stripped back to the basics. I'm going to start with the absolute basics. I apologise to those in my company, Edrington, if you're watching this and this is all very, very basic for you. But I think it's very valuable to start at the absolute beginning. So, what is whiskey? Well, a whiskey is a grain alcohol that can be made anywhere in the world using any combination of grain. There are great whiskies coming out of Japan, great whiskies coming out of Tasmania, India. Obviously, great whiskies coming out of here in America. But if you want to be called Scotch by law, there are 5 rules, 5 laws you have to adhere to. It has to be made on Scottish soil. It has to be aged for a minimum of 3 years in oak casks. And that maturation process also has to happen on Scottish soil, and it has to be a minimum of 40% ABV, alcohol by volume, same as 80 proof. And I say by law because we do actually have a legal body, the SWA, and SWA stands for the Scotch Whisky Association. It's not Scotties with Attitude. And it's the SWA's job to search the world looking for anyone using the word Scotch illegally and make sure that that situation is deleted. Because essentially the word Scotch on a bottle of whiskey is a GI, a geographical indicator. And we have a legal system surrounding the creation of Scotch whisky to ensure quality for our consumers. So when a consumer sees Scotch on a label, they know it's up to a particular level of purity and production, etc., etc. Now within Scotch, there are multiple levels as well. The bulk of Scotch whisky sales is actually blended Scotch. Approximately 90 to 92% of the worldwide sale of Scotch is blended Scotch, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. Then there's a very, very fine sliver of a style of Scotch called blended malt, and that's literally just multiple single malts put together. Blended together, if you will, but it's a blended malt. There's no neutral grain spirit in there whatsoever. And then the sort of upper echelon, if you will, is single malt. And the single malts are the ones that are held in very high regard. But to be a single malt, you have to adhere to the first 5 rules of Scotch, but then there's 2 more. And it's very simple: single and malt. The single part of single malt refers to a single geographical location, i.e. it can only be made at one distillery. And the malt part of single malt refers to only using malted barley. Because essentially, malted barley grows very, very well in Scotland. So back in the day when the Scots and the Irish were developing and perfecting how to make Scotch and Irish whiskey, barley was the grain that grew well and we had a plentiful supply of. But then, as the Brits decided to go across to America to colonise, they took their barley with them to continue making their whiskey. And they landed in New England and they started trying to plant their barley, and it didn't grow as well as the rye they were finding lying around New England. So they switched to rye, hence rye whiskey. And then as they started to go further south into the Carolinas, the rye wasn't growing as well as the corn they were finding lying around. So they switched to corn, hence bourbon. But it's just an evolution of the same drink spreading around the world. And just so that you know, the word whiskey is actually a Scottish word. It's derived from the Scots Gaelic word whisky. Whisky, the full term being whisky ba. It means water of life. Because if you've ever visited Scotland in the winter, you know you need something to get through. But whisky, the word whisky, which is Scots Gaelic for water, over the years just morphed and changed into the word whiskey. So, you're welcome. But we were the ones that developed it and helped sort of proliferate it. Now, later on in this series of videos, I'm going to go deeper into the history of Scotch whisky, but today is really just the basics. Talking about American whisky, as most of you know by now, hopefully, to be an American whisky, it has to be made in America, obviously, and aged in new white oak barrels. And if you want to be called bourbon, the mash bill has to be 51% corn, the rest can be anything, depending on the mash bill of the distillers. If you want to be a rye whiskey, 51% rye, the rest can be anything. There's a common misconception that bourbon can only be made in Kentucky. That's not the case. These days, everyone knows there's bourbons from all over the place. So just that's to be an American whiskey. And then I did mention earlier on about blended Scotch. Blended Scotch is a huge category, you know, a great volume play, about 90-92% of the world's sales. And to make a blended Scotch, what you do is you get approximately 70% of the bottle's volume is neutral grain spirit. And this is created in a different type of still to the pot stills that we make single malt out of. That actually the neutral grain spirit is created in column stills, sometimes known as continually running stills or coffee stills, invented by an Irish guy called Innis Coffee in the early 1800s. And this continually running still creates a wonderful, less expensive neutral grain spirit, but it's lacking in the character that you get from a pot still. So to give it the character that people were craving, the other 30% of the volume, you blend in single malts to give that neutral grain spirit the character that it's missing. And that's why it's called blended Scotch. And it's essentially just a value for money, because you can make blended Scotch a lot less expensive than it costs to make a single malt. So that's that. And then within Scotch whisky itself, there are peated and unpeated whiskies, and we have Macallan and Glenrothes, which are unpeated, but one of our other gems in our portfolio is Highland Park. Highland Park is our peated whisky. One of the least peated of all the peated whiskies, just a few, 4 or 5, 6 thousands phenols. And peating means that as you're drying the barley, you use peat, which is dense vegetation. It's been underground for thousands of years, and you dig it up. It's on its way to becoming coal if it's out there for 20,000 years or more. But we dig it up and we burn it, and it gives off this lovely, thick, unctuous smoke, and it attaches to the grain and carries through the process, and you end up getting this lovely, smoky element to the liquid, and that's peating. That's what you refer to as a peated Scotch. And the peated Scotches tend to be the ones in the Western Islands, up the west coast of Scotland, because the winds are very high there and there's not a lot of trees grow. It's all bushes and shrubs, so they don't have a lot of wood to dry the barley, so they use peat. And then very, very quickly, there are regions in Scotland. There's the Highland region, Campbelltown, Speyside, the Islands, Lowlands, and a lot of people think that this is to do with styles, and there are predominant styles within the regions, but really those regions were put in place for taxation purposes. And in one of the later episodes of this, I will be going deeper into regions and what is Macallan, what is Highland Park, and what are the other regions in Scotland. But I wanted to keep it nice, sharp, short. I'd like to thank you for tuning in.